Okay, so let's classify the joints. And we can classify the joints depending of the amount of movement that they allow, and that's the function of that joint, and that's a functional classification of joints. That's the first one. The second way to classify them is depending on how they look, what are the components, how are they formed, the anatomy of the joint, and that's a structural classification. Okay, so we have two, structural and functional classification. We're going to start describing the functional classification, which depending on the amount of movement that this joint that we're talking about or we're referring to allows, well, we're going to classify it, okay? And maybe when we think about joints, the first thought that comes to our mind are movement, right? Or your movement, your fingers, your head, your shoulders, your elbows, and all of those are diarthrosis. That's the type of articulation that allows a wide range of motion, or very or freely movable articulations. Now, in the other end of the spectrum, we have joints that we cannot move. And we have described them so far when we were describing the skull, for example, and we described the sutures, and we said that these are joints that but we cannot move it, we cannot move the bones of our skull. That's ah, that type of joints are called synarthrosis. So see that we're using that prefix I told you. Arthro means joints. So diarthrosis are joints that we can move freely. Synarthrosis are joints that we cannot move. Now, but we have something in the middle. It's a joint that is not freely movable, like the shoulder, but is not immovable like a suture. It allows a slight amount of movement, and usually we're not aware of the movement, but it's happening in there. And those are called amphiarthrosis. So they're right in the middle. Okay, they just allowed a slight range of motion in that joint. So those are the three types of joints according to the functional classification. I want you during the rest of our lives or our professional lives to keep these in mind. And now in the next slide, I'm going to describe for you the second way to classify the joints, the structural classification of joints. But at the same time, we're going to mix and match these two systems of classification. We're going to describe a structural joint, and we're going to assign to that joint to one of these three groups, a synarthrosis, amphiarthrosis, or diarthrosis. So before moving to the next slide, I want you to master, memorize, understand this. It has to be whoop, on the surface of your brain. See ya!